Alrighty, welcome to Nikos. I'm Jonathan Albin and this is Game Master's Toolbox, and today we are going to be talking about combat. So today we're going to be looking at how combat has evolved over time, what roleplay does to the conflict resolution of combat, and how we can make the sessions more enjoyable, more thrilling, and accomplish more within the fight scenes. If you're new to the channel, make sure you go down below and click all the buttons so that you let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and let's get after it.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame.
Alrighty, so welcome to Nikos RPG. As I said, I'm Jonathan, and I've been game mastering, as you may know, for 50 years, and so there are a lot of topics that we could talk about wherein we can wax poetic on what's going on in the games world and all of that. But today we're going to be talking in particular about combat and how to make the sessions make sense. Most of us have been playing role-play games for at least some period of time, and if you haven't, one thing I will recommend is that you get yourself into a games group as quickly as you can. Check out your local game store and find out where the conflicts are and immerse yourself. But one of the greatest memories of role-play games is always the conflicts, the big combat scenes. And whether what you remember is the wonderful dynamics and the dangers that you experienced within the fight scene that made it feel real to you, or whether you are just ruing how horrible the conflicts can be and how much of a problem they are, it is the conflict itself that is the greatest memories that we have of role-play games. So let's talk about our story so far. In the beginning, as I've said before, combat was a extenuating series of conditions that were inevitable, and fundamentally the game was based on these fight scenes. Yes, there was the grabbing of loot, and we've already had the long discussion about how the concept of earned experience developed. But what we do remember more than anything is that at early levels, the hit point pool mechanism seems to work fairly well in determining how long a fight lasts. The threats are real. The amount of damage that a player might take does represent their likelihood of reaching demise, and so it is a scary proposition. But as the game progresses and the levels increase, there is a dread that starts to form in the hearts of players, because there's a challenge looming of which the players wouldn't even be aware. Of course, I'm referring to the dreaded Combat Slog. When you reach the mid-levels, mid-tiers of role-play games like Dungeons & Dragons, you run into a situation where the hit point pool is great enough to weather even a flurry of attacks by an opponent, and thereby takes away the threat and the damage and the danger level that the players are experiencing. And ironically, the very idea of being protected from this potential death actually downplays the threat that the conflicting would have resolved, and therefore takes away the player's need to manage the damage that they're taking. That means now the situation has resolved away from when the combat is going to be over, but whether or not the players are going to persevere simply by the pile of hit points that they have. And this leads, therefore, to a lack of danger, a lack of fear, and therefore a resolved action by the players. That means they no longer are threatened by the fight. Now, if we do a comparison between between a combat scene in a role-play game and perhaps a combat scene in a movie, there's a radical difference, and that is in the motion picture, in the movie, they've got a predetermined success failure, and they can sculpt the action in advance to ensure that the conditions are met for the heroes to succeed and the villains to fail, and there's never any real threat of the players being removed. Now, this is where the irony is that as role-play games advance, you also have no lack of fear, no lack of danger, but there's now no longer any cinematics to the fight scene, so that there is a foregone conclusion of the player's success, and therefore you strip the movie of the danger, so to speak. You strip from the conflict the player's threat, their player's danger, and when you do so, you blandify. You make it more common, more bland, more boring, and especially if you're utilizing mechanisms like the Dungeons and Dragons hit, miss, single threshold structure, you have no way of resolving the fight other than the elimination of the villain, which does require, again, that combat slog. Movies don't. So that means that for a conflict to be realistic, there has to be no expectation of success. The threat level of the fight should always be there. There should always be the possibility that the bad guys will prevail and the good guys will suffer. And by removing these expectations, you put back inherently the dangers that a player theoretically should be experiencing in the fight scene. He should be literally thinking about how to resolve the conflict, how to succeed. And that really means depend upon the skills that they've built into their story, into their characters, and figure out how to make those conflicts work to their favor. It also means that you need to have a mechanism that allows for there to be a more fluid interpretation of what's going on, and it should be, while it is based on arbitrary die rolls, it should be more manageable in terms of interpreting how those results occur. Now, in Dungeons and Dragons, there is no such threshold. You have a success failure number, and that is all you have to work with. But in a mechanism like Nikos RPG, you have graduated relative success values, and so you can actually perceptually see, for example, the difference between a partial success and a wild success, and convey conditions on the fight scene based on those, which therefore leverages the outcome so that the players and the characters involved are driving the story by the actions that they choose to interact with and the conditions that they put upon the battlefield. Now, what that means is that the clarity of the conflict can be seen in the handwriting, so to speak, turn over turn. If you are resolving a series of actions where the players have been getting really good advantages and really good conditions that they can place on the villain, the likelihood of the villain in winning becomes depleted, and it becomes much more likely that the players will win. But that means you also have to clear up what the villain is really attempting to do. If it is a monstrous, destructive creature and all it's trying to do is deal damage, if it's not being successful in that, it should be considered as fundamentally demoralized and wanting to get out of the fight. And so therefore you start to be able to build into the verbals, the narrative of the conflict, those emotional states and those conditions, which either predicate a change in combat stage, for which you should have already had a plan, or in other cases, literally cause the villain to reconsider its action and determine its exit strategy. This means that the monsters, the creatures that you're engaging as your villains, really need to be able to understand where they are in the conflict. The idea of martial conflict with no ramifications other than win or loss should really be left to the most base of creatures, whereas those with any kind of intellect should be able to see the handwriting on the wall, roll with the punches, and make decisions based on what's going on in the fight scene. If they are clearly losing, they therefore should be considering what their alternatives would be to the fight scene, or should be determining whether they are going to, as I said, change up the stage and become more dangerous. And if you've written this in, if you've predefined what the villain's actions will be, it'll be easier to show those transitions within the fight, making it feel more cinematic as you're able to see in the previous rounds what might be the outcome in the end. Well, this, of course, leads to the point that the villains need to eventually be able to accept and understand and choose their exit. If they are sentient and aware of conditions and are aware that they are losing, perhaps they have an out. Perhaps there is a way by which they can pull a rabbit out of a hat, so to speak, by a special condition or move that you've already built into the story. Or conversely, you can choose to allow them a cinematic withdrawal. And to do that, you have to really choose an exit and determine what the success-failure protocol would be for that. And by having that in your mind when you're playing, you can already feel the confidence of what the actions might come out to be without expecting that outcome. That means you need to be able to gauge your responses based on the dice rolls and the environment that's been set up. So if the conditions have set them up for failure, be prepared for them to resign, to quit, to surrender. Or conversely, to make one gratuitously extreme output opportunity for something really cinematic to occur and give them that dynamic. Now, this applies both to the good guys and bad guys, so you want to make sure that the players are aware of their options as well, so that the entire fight scene can feel as if it's been choreographed as you've seen the action move across the terrain and the different conditions of the battlefield become useful or apparent. Now, when you're dealing with a non-Nikos RPG system, it's a little more difficult, and so in those cases, my resolution would be to use a 3 strikes rule. Fundamentally, when the heroes have visited upon the villains 3 conclusive successes, whether they be critical hits or whether they've been significantly damaged by the fight, at the end of the 3rd critical action, they should be ready to surrender or to submit, regardless of their hit point pool. And one of the reasons why you would want to obviate the hit point pool is that it's fundamentally unrealistic at those high levels. A simple sword wouldn't be enough to deal enough damage to change that. But instead, the very concept of taking conclusive damage and finding yourself in consistent threats by the enemy really has provided your villain and your characters with an awareness of the end of the fight. And utilizing the 3 strikes, you can simply call the fight. Now, some would argue that this is defeating the combat system, and if you are playing the game for the hit point track, then the rule of law will overcome the rule of cool. But from a cinematic standpoint, from a playful standpoint, a clear 3 strike rule will provide your characters with the exaltation of their success based on their actions, and also provide your villain with the opportunity to surrender without the ultimate death requirement that Dungeons and Dragons and other methods require. So, as we come to the end of this, the real question is, what makes for a great conflict? And the great conflict really is going to be based on your personal experience. Experience is the best guide for these things, and if you've been game mastering as long as I have, I think you'll see how a 3 strikes method for a Dungeons and Dragons type conflict or a relative conflict like the Nikos RPG provides is a great way to move the action by the actions of the players. encounter round after encounter round. And I also need to ask this question: if you're a player, when has been the greatest combat scenes that you've ever engaged with? Let's share with us what happened in those games, and let's have a great conversation about that. Do remember that your players are going to be the best judges, so if you think you had a great game, make sure you check it out with your players and get feedback, and that will make your games greater over time. Now, thanks for being here. Remember, we record 5 times a week, so make sure you subscribe so you can get all of that information when new videos come down. And we will see you in the next one. And as Grandfather would say, go play.